The rain hammered against the windows of Neverland Ranch like bullets against armor. Michael Jackson sat in his private studio, fingers dancing across piano keys, when the phone rang. It was 3 in the morning on December 15th, 1987, and most of the world was asleep. But sleep had always been elusive for the king of pop, especially when his mind churned with melodies and dreams of making the world a better place. Michael. The voice on the other end was shaky, desperate. It belonged to Dr. Sarah Chun, a pediatric surgeon at Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. Michael had met her during one of his many visits to sick children, part of his lifelong mission to bring joy to those who needed it most. "Sarah, what's wrong?" Michael's soft voice carried immediate concern. He could hear chaos in the background, sirens, shouting, the unmistakable sounds of emergency. "There's been an accident," she said, her words tumbling over each other. A school bus carrying 32 kids from the inner city crashed on the freeway. "We have them all here now, but Michael, we need help. The hospital is overcrowded, understaffed, and we don't have enough resources. Some of these children might not make it through the night." Michael's heart stopped. Children in danger. The two words that could mobilize him faster than anything else on earth. His own childhood had been stolen from him, sacrificed on the altar of stardom, but he had made a sacred promise to himself. No child would suffer if he could prevent it. "What do you need?" he asked, already moving toward his bedroom to change clothes. "Everything," Sarah replied. "Medical equipment, specialists, money for surgeries. But mostly, we need hope. These kids are scared, Michael. Some are alone because their parents can't get here. Others are facing surgeries. They might not survive. They need something to believe in." Michael was already pulling on his clothes, his mind racing. "I'm coming," he said simply. "Michael, you don't understand. The media will be everywhere. If you show up, it'll be a circus. These children need medical attention, not a spectacle." But Michael had already made his decision. "Then we make sure it's not a spectacle," he said with quiet determination. "Sarah, I need you to trust me. Can you keep the press away for a few hours?" I can try. But Michael, even if you come, what can you really do? You're not a doctor." Michael paused at his bedroom door, looking back at the piano where he had been composing just minutes before. On the music stand sat the unfinished lyrics to a song about healing, about love conquering all. Sometimes life gave you the chance to live your own lyrics. "Maybe I'm not a doctor," he said softly, "but I know something about miracles. And sometimes, that's exactly what children need." After hanging up, Michael moved with purpose through his mansion. He called his security chief, his personal assistant, and his financial manager. Within 20 minutes, he had arranged for medical equipment to be airlifted from 3 different hospitals, hired additional surgeons, and transferred $500,000 to the hospital's emergency fund. But money and equipment were just the beginning. As he drove through the storm toward Los Angeles, Michael's mind was focused on something far more important: the faces of 32 children who were fighting for their lives. He thought about the countless kids he had met over the years, the ones who had looked at him with eyes full of wonder despite their pain. The media would never know about this night. His publicist would make sure of that. This wasn't about headlines or image. This was about a promise he had made to himself long ago, when he was just a child performer, longing for a normal childhood. He couldn't save his own innocence, but he could fight for theirs. As the lights of the city grew brighter through his windshield, Michael felt something he rarely experienced: absolute certainty. The world knew him as an entertainer, a performer who could make stadiums full of people scream with joy. But tonight, he would become something else entirely. Tonight, Michael Jackson would become a guardian angel. The hospital loomed ahead in the darkness, its windows blazing with light like a beacon of hope. Inside those walls, 32 young souls were fighting the biggest battle of their lives. They didn't know it yet, but they weren't fighting alone. Michael pulled into the hospital parking garage, his hand steady on the wheel despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. He had faced hostile crowds, demanding media, and the pressure of global fame. But nothing had ever felt as important as this moment. He turned off the engine and sat in the darkness for just a moment, saying a silent prayer for the children upstairs. Then he stepped out into the storm, ready to fight the most important battle of his life. The hospital's emergency entrance was a war zone of controlled chaos. Paramedics rushed through automatic doors, pushing gurneys, while nurses ran alongside shouting medical terms. Michael pulled his fedora low and wrapped his jacket tight, but his disguise was unnecessary. Every person in that building had only one focus: saving lives. Dr. Sarah Chin met him at the elevator, her surgical scrubs stained with evidence of the night's battles. Her eyes, red with exhaustion and tears, lit up with desperate hope when she saw him. "Michael, thank God you came. But I have to warn you, it's worse than I described on the phone." Her voice cracked as they rode up to the pediatric floor. "We lost one already. A little girl named Maria. She was only 8. The words hit Michael like physical blows. He closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of the world's pain settling on his shoulders. But this was no time for grief. The living needed him now. "Tell me about the others," he said quietly. 31 children, ages 6 to 16. Multiple trauma cases, broken bones, internal bleeding, head injuries. We've got them spread across 3 floors, because we simply don't have space. The worst cases are in intensive care. But Michael, some of these kids..." She paused, struggling with her words. "Some of them are giving up. They're scared, alone, and they think they're going to die." The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway that looked more like a battlefield medical station than a children's hospital. Beds lined the corridors, each one holding a small figure, surrounded by machines and tubes. Parents sat in plastic chairs, some weeping quietly, others staring into space with the hollow look of those who had seen too much. Michael's trained eye took in everything: the overwhelmed staff, the inadequate equipment, the atmosphere of barely controlled panic. But what struck him most were the children themselves. Despite their injuries, despite their fear, many of them were trying to be brave. A boy with his arm in a cast was comforting a younger girl in the bed next to him. A teenager with bandages around her head was holding the hand of a crying 6-year-old. "They're taking care of each other," Michael whispered. "They have been all night," Sarah confirmed. "These kids barely know each other. They're from different schools, different neighborhoods, but somehow they've become a family." Michael felt his resolve strengthen. This wasn't just about medical care anymore. This was about protecting something precious and fragile: the incredible capacity of children to find light in the darkest moments. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If I can get you everything you need, more doctors, better equipment, unlimited resources, what are the real chances for these kids?" Dr. Chen looked at him for a long moment. "With what we have now, we'll lose at least 3 more tonight, maybe 5, with unlimited resources." She paused, calculating. "We could save them all. Every single one. Then that's what we're going to do." Michael's voice carried a quiet intensity that made Sarah believe, for the first time that night, that miracles might actually be possible. He pulled out his phone and began making calls. Within minutes, he had helicopter medical teams flying in from San Francisco and Phoenix. He arranged for the country's top pediatric trauma surgeon to be flown in from Johns Hopkins. He had medical equipment manufacturers opening their warehouses at 4 in the morning. But even as he worked his financial magic, Michael's eyes kept returning to the children. A little boy, maybe 7 years old, was staring at him with wide eyes despite the oxygen mask covering half his face. Michael approached the bed slowly. "Hey there, champion. What's your name?" The boy's eyes grew even wider. Even through pain and medication, he recognized the most famous face in the world. But instead of excitement, Michael saw something else: hope. "Tommy," the boy whispered through his mask. "Well, Tommy, I'm Michael, and I want you to know something very important." Michael knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to the child's eye level. "You're going to be okay. All of you are going to be okay. I promise." It was a dangerous promise to make. Michael knew that. But as he looked into Tommy's eyes, he saw something that made his heart skip. The child believed him. And somehow, that belief seemed to spread to the nearby beds. Children who had been lying still and scared began to sit up slightly, craning their necks to see the man who had just promised them everything would be all right. A nurse rushed over, clearly recognizing Michael, but professional enough to focus on her patient. "Sir, I need to check Tommy's vitals." "Of course," Michael said, starting to move away. "Wait," Tommy called out weakly. Will you stay?" Michael looked at Sarah, who nodded. "I'm not going anywhere, Tommy. None of us are going anywhere until everyone goes home." As medical equipment began arriving and specialist doctors started appearing, Michael realized something profound was happening. The atmosphere in the hospital was changing. The sense of hopelessness was being replaced by something electric. The feeling that extraordinary things were possible. He had started the night thinking he would write checks and arrange for medical care. But now he understood that this battle would require everything he had to give. By 5 in the morning, Children's Hospital of Los Angeles had been transformed into something unprecedented in medical history. The normally quiet hallways hummed with purposeful energy as world-class surgeons worked alongside local doctors, using equipment that had been impossible to obtain just hours earlier. Michael had shed his jacket and fedora, working in shirt sleeves as he moved between floors like a general coordinating a complex military operation. But this wasn't about logistics anymore. Somewhere between arranging the third helicopter evacuation of medical supplies and personally reassuring a terrified mother that her son would survive, Michael had realized something crucial. The children weren't just fighting for their physical lives. They were fighting to keep their spirits alive. In room 314, 12-year-old Marcus lay with both legs in traction, his dark eyes reflecting a pain that went beyond his physical injuries. Michael had learned his story from the nurses. Marcus was the oldest of 4 kids, essentially raising his younger siblings, while his mother worked 3 jobs. The accident had happened during a rare school trip, the first time Marcus had been anywhere outside his neighborhood. "I should have been home," Marcus whispered when Michael sat beside his bed. "My little brothers needed me, and I went on some stupid trip. Now look what happened." Michael felt his heart break. Here was a 12-year-old boy carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, blaming himself for an accident that was completely beyond his control. "Marcus, can I tell you something? When I was your age, I thought everything bad that happened was my fault too. I thought if I just worked harder, sang better, danced faster, I could protect everyone I loved." The boy's eyes focused on Michael with intense interest. Here was someone who might actually understand. "But you know what I learned?" Michael continued. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let other people help. Sometimes being strong means knowing when to accept love." Down the hall, 15-year-old Rosa was refusing to let doctors examine her head injury. She kept insisting she was fine, that other kids needed attention more than she did. The medical team was growing frustrated. They suspected a serious concussion, but Rosa wouldn't cooperate with their tests. Michael found her sitting up in bed, arms crossed defiantly, despite the obvious pain in her eyes. Her protective instincts reminded him of himself at that age, always trying to shield others from worry, even at his own expense. "Rosa, right?" Michael said, approaching carefully. "The nurses tell me you're being pretty tough on them." "I'm fine," she said through gritted teeth. "These doctors should help the little kids first." "You know what? You're absolutely right to look out for the younger ones. That's what leaders do." Michael sat down, not as a celebrity, but as someone who genuinely understood her burden. But even leaders need to take care of themselves. Because if you're not okay, who's going to help protect everyone else? Something in his tone reached her. Maybe it was the way he didn't treat her like a stubborn child, but like someone whose instincts he respected and understood. Meanwhile, in the intensive care unit, 6-year-old Emma hadn't spoken since the accident. Her physical injuries were healing well, but she lay motionless, staring at the ceiling with eyes that had seen too much. Her parents sat beside her bed, taking turns reading stories and singing songs, but Emma remained unreachable. When Michael appeared in the doorway, Emma's parents looked up with desperate hope. They had heard whispers throughout the hospital about the mysterious benefactor who was performing miracles, but seeing him in person left them speechless. "May I?" Michael asked softly, gesturing toward Emma's bedside. Her father nodded, tears in his eyes. "We've tried everything. She hasn't said a word since the accident." Michael pulled up a chair and sat quietly for a moment, not speaking, not trying to entertain or perform. He simply sat with Emma in her silence, letting her know that she wasn't alone in her pain. "You know, Emma," he finally said, so softly that her parents had to lean in to hear. "Sometimes when scary things happen, it feels safer to stay very quiet. Like if we don't make any noise, maybe the scary feelings will go away." Emma's eyes flickered toward him, the first response she had shown to anyone. "But I want to tell you a secret," Michael continued. "Even when we're scared, even when everything feels broken, there's still music inside us. It's always there, waiting for us to be ready to hear it again." He began to hum, so gently it was barely audible. It wasn't one of his famous songs, just a simple melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul. Emma's breathing changed subtly, and her parents noticed her fingers beginning to move slightly, as if she were trying to catch the melody in her hands. Throughout the hospital, similar scenes were playing out. Michael seemed to be everywhere at once, encouraging a terrified 10-year-old before surgery, helping a nurse carry supplies, sitting with parents who had nowhere else to turn. But he wasn't working alone anymore. The children who were able to move were helping too, creating an atmosphere of mutual support that the medical staff had never witnessed. Tommy, the 7-year-old who had recognized Michael first, had become an unofficial ambassador, wheeling his 4-stand from room to room to check on other kids. "Mr. Michael says we're all going to be okay," he would announce to anyone who would listen. He promised. Dr. Sarachan found Michael in the hallway around dawn, slumped against a wall for just a moment of rest. She had been watching him for hours, marveling at his ability to be exactly what each child needed, sometimes a friend, sometimes a protector, always a source of unshakable hope. "Michael, how do you do it?" she asked. "How do you give so much of yourself and still keep going?" Michael looked at her with eyes that held years of their own pain and healing. "Sarah, I spent my whole childhood performing for other people, trying to make them happy while I was dying inside. But these kids, they're not asking me to perform. They're just asking me to care. And caring, that's the first thing I ever learned to do that felt completely real." The sun was beginning to rise over Los Angeles, painting the hospital windows with golden light. The worst of the medical crisis had passed, but Michael knew the real battle was just beginning. Healing bodies was only the first step. Now came the harder task, helping 31 young souls find their way back to believing in tomorrow. The morning sun streamed through the hospital windows as something extraordinary began to unfold. What had started as a desperate medical emergency was transforming into something that none of the staff had ever witnessed. A community of healing that seemed to generate its own momentum. Michael stood in the pediatric ward's main hallway, watching a scene that filled him with quiet amazement. Tommy, now stable but still connected to his 4, had organized the mobile children into what he called the helper squad. Kids with minor injuries were reading to those confined to bed. Teenagers were teaching younger children how to make paper airplanes with their good arms. Even Emma, who still hadn't spoken, was sitting up in her wheelchair, carefully drawing pictures to give to children who couldn't leave their beds. "It's like they've created their own world in here," Dr. Chen observed, joining Michael as they watched 12-year-old Marcus direct the wheelchair brigade with the authority of a seasoned commander, his broken legs propped up but his spirit completely intact. "They're healing each other," Michael replied softly. "Kids understand something adults forget. That broken doesn't mean powerless." But Michael knew that the most challenging cases were yet to be resolved. In room 318, 16-year-old David remained in critical condition following emergency surgery for internal bleeding. He had been unconscious for 18 hours, and his parents hadn't left his bedside. David was the captain of his school's basketball team, a straight-A student with dreams of becoming an engineer. The accident had shattered more than his ribs. It had potentially destroyed everything he had worked toward. Michael entered David's room quietly, acknowledging his parents with a gentle nod. They had been there all night, taking turns holding their son's hand and whispering encouragements into the silence. "How is he?" Michael asked. David's mother, Lisa, looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "The surgery went well, but he's not waking up. The doctors say his body is fighting, but—" Her voice broke. "He's always been such a fighter. He's never given up on anything in his life." Michael approached the bed, where David lay surrounded by machines. The teenager looked smaller than his 6-foot frame should allow, vulnerability written across his unconscious features. "David," Michael said clearly, "I know you can hear me. I know you're in there, fighting harder than you've ever fought anything. But I want you to know something, okay? Whatever happens with basketball, whatever happens with school, whatever happens with any of the plans you made, none of that defines how amazing you are." He pulled a chair close to the bed and continued talking, not as a celebrity, but as someone who understood the pressure of having the world's expectations on your shoulders. "When I was your age, I thought my whole worth depended on being perfect, on never letting anyone down. But you know what I've learned? The real victories aren't the ones that end up in newspapers. They're the quiet moments when you choose to keep believing, even when everything seems impossible." Something flickered across David's face, just the slightest movement of his eyelids. Meanwhile, 3 floors up in the hospital's administrative wing, something else remarkable was happening. News of the night's events had somehow leaked despite all efforts at secrecy. But instead of creating the media circus everyone had feared, it had sparked something unprecedented. Michael's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Other celebrities were calling, offering to help. Major corporations were pledging resources. Medical professionals from across the country were volunteering their services. What had started as one man's private mission was becoming a movement. But the most meaningful call came from an unexpected source. "Michael." The voice was young, shaky but determined. "Yes, this is Jake Morrison. I was supposed to be on that bus." Michael felt his breath catch. "What do you mean?" "I'm 14. I go to the same school as a lot of those kids. I was supposed to go on the field trip, but I got suspended last week for fighting. My mom said it was my own fault I missed out." Jake's voice cracked. "But now I'm watching the news, and all my friends are hurt, and I feel like maybe I could have helped somehow if I had been there." Michael closed his eyes, feeling the familiar ache of survivor's guilt, an emotion he knew all too well from his own complicated childhood. "Jake, can I ask you something? Why were you fighting at school?" A long pause. "This kid was picking on my little sister. He kept saying mean stuff about her braces, making her cry every day. I told him to stop, but he wouldn't listen, so I hit him." Michael felt something shift in his chest. Here was a boy punishing himself for missing a tragedy, when the truth was that he had been standing up for someone who couldn't protect herself. "Jake, where are you right now?" "Home. But I've been thinking. All those kids are probably scared, right? And lonely? I was wondering if... I know I can't visit because of my suspension, but maybe I could write them letters? Or draw pictures. I'm not very good at art, but I thought maybe. Jake, what's your address?" 2 hours later, a car pulled up outside Jake's modest apartment building. When he opened the door, he found Michael Jackson standing on his doorstep, but more importantly, he found someone who understood exactly how he felt. "I thought you might want to come with me to the hospital," Michael said simply. Back at Children's Hospital, David's eyelids were fluttering more frequently. His parents held their breath as Michael continued talking to their son, sharing stories about overcoming fear, about finding strength in unexpected places, about the importance of fighting not just for yourself, but for everyone who believes in you. "The thing is, David," Michael was saying, "your friends need you to come back, not because they need their team captain or their study group leader, but because they need their friend. They need to see that it's possible to face something terrible and still choose to keep living." David's fingers twitched. Then slowly, his eyes opened. The moment was electric. Lisa grabbed her husband's hand, while tears streamed down both their faces. Medical staff rushed in, but David's gaze was fixed on Michael with an intensity that spoke of recognition and gratitude beyond words. "Did we win?" David whispered. Michael smiled, understanding immediately that David wasn't asking about basketball or academics or any of the things that had seemed so important before the accident. "Yeah," Michael said softly. "We won." As news of David's awakening spread through the hospital, something magical happened. The helper squad cheered from their beds and wheelchairs. Emma spoke her first words since the accident, asking if David was okay. Parents who had been strangers began hugging each other in the hallways. But the real miracle was yet to come. As Jake walked through the hospital doors for the first time, carrying a backpack full of handmade cards and drawings for his classmates, Michael realized that the night had created something far more powerful than anyone had imagined. They hadn't just saved 31 children. They had proven that when people choose to fight for each other, when they refuse to let fear and despair win, miracles don't just happen, they multiply. 3 weeks had passed since that transformative night, but the ripple effects continued to spread far beyond the walls of Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. What had begun as one man's desperate mission to help injured children had evolved into something that would change hundreds of lives forever. Michael stood in the hospital's brand-new recreation room, a space that hadn't existed a month ago but was now the heart of the pediatric wing. The room buzzed with laughter and conversation as children in various stages of recovery played games, worked on art projects, and helped newer patients adjust to hospital life. The walls were covered with drawings, letters from well-wishers around the world, and photographs documenting their journey from that terrible night to this moment of healing. Tommy, now fully recovered but still visiting daily as a volunteer, was teaching origami to a group of younger children who had arrived after a separate accident. His patient instruction and gentle encouragement showed no trace of the frightened boy who had whispered his name through an oxygen mask just weeks before. "Mr. Michael," Tommy called out, holding up a paper crane. "Look what Maria learned to make." Michael felt his breath catch. Maria was the name of the 8-year-old girl they had lost that first night, the one Dr. Chun had mentioned in her tearful update. But this Maria was different, a 6-year-old who had arrived last week after a playground accident, scared and alone until Tommy and the other veteran patients had welcomed her into their family. "That's beautiful, Maria," Michael said, kneeling to admire her work. "Tommy's a good teacher, isn't he?" The little girl nodded enthusiastically, her fear from a week ago completely replaced by the confidence that comes from being part of something bigger than yourself. Across the room, David sat in his wheelchair, still not able to walk, but making remarkable progress, tutoring younger children in math and science. His college dreams had shifted since the accident, but they had evolved into something even more meaningful. He was planning to study biomedical engineering, driven by a desire to create better medical equipment for children's hospitals. "I want to invent things that make it less scary for kids like us," he had told Michael during one of their many conversations. "Like for machines that look like friendly robots, or monitoring equipment that plays music." The most remarkable transformation belonged to Emma. The silent 6-year-old had not only found her voice again, but had become the hospital's unofficial storyteller. Every afternoon, she would gather whoever was able to listen and tell elaborate tales about brave children who went on magical adventures. Her stories always featured heroes who were different, who had to overcome challenges that made them special rather than broken. But it was Jake who had perhaps traveled the farthest emotional distance. The boy who had missed the original bus accident due to his suspension had become an integral part of the hospital community. He visited every day after school, helping with homework, organizing activities, and providing the kind of peer support that no adult could offer. Michael watched as Jake helped Marcus, now walking with crutches, but still struggling with self-doubt, practice his physical therapy exercises. "Come on, Marcus," Jake encouraged. "Remember what Mr. Michael always says. We're not trying to go back to who we were before. We're becoming who we were always meant to be." Dr. Sarah Chun appeared beside Michael, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of amazed satisfaction. The exhausted emergency room doctor from that terrible night had been replaced by someone who had witnessed the impossible and been forever changed by it. "The board approved our proposal," she announced quietly. "We're officially establishing the Second Chance program as a permanent part of the hospital. Dedicated trauma counselors, peer support groups, family services, everything we learned that night about healing the whole person, not just the injury." Michael smiled, but his attention was drawn to the room's far corner, where Rosa was working with a new patient, a teenager who had been in a car accident and was refusing to speak to the counselors. Rosa's approach was patient and understanding, sharing her own story of trying to be strong for everyone else while falling apart inside. "You know," Sarah continued, "I keep waiting for the media attention to die down, for people to move on to the next story. But it's not happening. The foundation you established has raised over $3 million. We've had medical volunteers from 40 states. And the letters. She gestured to boxes stacked along one wall. We're getting thousands of letters from children around the world, sharing their own stories, asking how they can help. Michael nodded, but his focus remained on the children. Money and media attention were tools, nothing more. What mattered was the transformation he witnessed every day in this room. Children who had faced their darkest moments and emerged not just stronger, but more compassionate. "Sarah," he said quietly, "do you remember what you asked me that night? How I keep giving so much of myself?" "I remember. I think I gave you the wrong answer." Michael turned to face her fully. "I said it was about caring, and that's true. But I'm learning something else from these kids. The secret isn't how much you give. It's how much you're willing to receive." He gestured toward the room, full of healing children. "Every one of these kids has taught me something. Tommy showed me that hope doesn't require guarantees. Sometimes believing is enough. David proved that our greatest dreams can survive our worst moments. Emma taught me that silence doesn't mean emptiness. Sometimes it means you're gathering strength for something important." As if summoned by his words, Emma appeared at Michael's side, tugging gently on his sleeve. "Mr. Michael," she said in her clear, sweet voice, "will you tell them the story about the night we became a family?" Michael looked around the room at the faces turned toward him expectantly. Children from that original bus accident, mixed with newer patients who had been welcomed into this extraordinary community. Jake had put down his homework to listen. Marcus had paused his physical therapy. Even the teenagers had stopped their conversations. "Which story should I tell?" Michael asked Emma with a smile. "The true one," she replied solemnly. "About how sometimes the worst night becomes the beginning of the best thing." Michael settled into the large chair that had become his designated storytelling spot, and the children gathered around him with the eager attention that had become their afternoon ritual. "Once upon a time," he began, "there was a terrible storm, and a phone call that changed everything. It was the kind of night when most people would have stayed safely inside, but sometimes the most important journeys begin when you decide to walk into the storm." As Michael told the story of their shared transformation, he realized something profound. He had started that night thinking he was coming to rescue these children, but the truth was more complex and more beautiful than he had imagined. They had rescued each other, and in the process, they had proven something that the world desperately needed to remember, that healing isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose to do together, one act of courage at a time. Outside the windows, the sun was setting over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. But inside the recreation room of Children's Hospital, the real light came from something far more enduring, the unshakable belief that tomorrow could always be better than today, as long as people were willing to fight for each other. The story had ended, but the legacy would continue forever,